Imagine walking into a candlelit hall, so vast its ceiling disappears into shadow, where the air hums with whispered conversations and the clink of golden goblets. Tables groan under the weight of roasted peacocks, sugar sculptures, and rivers of wine, but this is no ordinary feast. Every bite, every toast, every glance exchanged across the table is a move in a high-stakes game of power. Welcome to the medieval banquet, where the real course being served wasn't food, it was politics. At first glance, these gatherings might seem like simple celebrations of wealth, a chance for nobles to flaunt their riches. But peel back the velvet curtains, and you'll find a world where seating arrangements could make or break alliances, where a misplaced salt cellar might insult a king, and where the choice of who received the first slice of meat could signal a shift in the balance of power. These banquets were carefully choreographed performances, with every detail from the placement of guests to the symbolism of the dishes designed to send messages sharper than any dagger. So why does this matter to us today? Because beneath the opulence, these feasts reveal a universal truth about human nature. Power has always been won and lost not just on battlefields, but over shared meals. Whether it's a modern-day business lunch or a royal wedding banquet, the rituals of dining still shape our world in ways we rarely notice. In this video, we'll pull up a seat at history's most strategic tables, uncovering how medieval hosts used feasts to manipulate, impress, and even intimidate their guests. Get ready to see these extravagant gatherings in a whole new light as the ultimate power plays behind castle walls. Long before medieval banquets became elaborate spectacles of power, they began as something far simpler, a practical necessity. In the early Middle Ages, when castles were more fortresses than palaces, sharing a meal was about survival as much as social order. A lord would gather his vassals, household knights, and even visiting travelers around a single long table, reinforcing the idea that loyalty and protection flowed both ways. The act of breaking bread together wasn't just tradition, it was the glue holding feudal society together. But as kingdoms grew more centralized, so did the symbolism of these meals. Take Charlemagne's court in the late 8th century. The Carolingian emperor didn't just feed his guests, he transformed feasting into a political ritual. Chroniclers describe how he'd seat foreign ambassadors closest to him, while rebellious nobles found themselves placed strategically near the doors, a silent reminder of their precarious standing. Even the menu became propaganda. Exotic spices imported from the East weren't just luxuries but proof of an empire's reach. By the 12th century, the stakes had risen dramatically. When Richard the Lionheart prepared for the Third Crusade, he didn't just rally his barons with speeches. He hosted weeks of banquets where the wine flowed as freely as the promises of land and titles. These weren't celebrations, they were contractual negotiations disguised as merriment. A knight who drank from the king's own cup wasn't just honored, he was publicly bound to his sovereign's cause. What's fascinating is how these early feasts set the template for centuries of political theater. The choice of who carved the meat, the order in which toasts were made, even the type of bread served, all of it carried coded messages. A lord might serve plain rye bread to one guest and delicate white loaves to another, quietly reinforcing hierarchies without saying a word. This was power performed not through decrees or battles, but through honeyed pastries and the careful arrangement of seating. The genius of these gatherings lay in their dual nature. To the outside world, they appeared as acts of generosity, upholding the medieval ideal of noble largesse. But behind the scenes, every detail was calculated, from the number of courses served to the timing of dessert. A well-timed sugar sculpture of a castle might remind guests of the host's military strength, while a fountain flowing with wine demonstrated control over scarce resources. What began as communal sustenance had become the original power lunch, one where the tableware was just as deadly as any sword. Picture a table so laden with silver and gold that the flickering candlelight nearly blinds the guests' platters piled high with swans roasted in their feathers, towering sugar castles that took months to craft, and wine flowing from fountains shaped like mythical beasts. This wasn't just dinner, it was a calculated spectacle of dominance. In an era before newspapers or social media, a ruler's reputation hinged on what their guests saw, tasted, and most importantly remembered. Every gilded platter, every imported spice, even the way food was arranged screamed one unmistakable message: this is how powerful I am. Take Henry VIII's legendary Field of the Cloth of Gold Banquet in 1520. The English king didn't just serve food, he staged an edible empire. His kitchens prepared thousands of dishes, from venison pastries dyed with precious saffron to marzipan sculptures of his own royal crest. But the real power move, the sheer waste. Chronicles describe how entire courses were left uneaten, cleared away to make room for the next wave of extravagance. Why? Because only a king with bottomless coffers could afford to treat rare delicacies as disposable. For ambassadors from rival courts, the message was clear: England's wealth was inexhaustible. The ingredients themselves were walking political statements. Spices like pepper and cinnamon, worth their weight in gold, weren't just flavor enhancers, they were proof of a ruler's global trade networks. Serving peacock or whale meat, creatures steeped in medieval symbolism, whispered of divine favor and territorial control. Even something as simple as the color of bread spoke volumes. While peasants ate coarse brown loaves, nobles flaunted snow-white bread made from sifted flour, a luxury so excessive, some church leaders condemned it as sinful vanity. But perhaps the most cunning aspect of these displays was their ambiguity. A guest might marvel at the host's generosity while quietly tallying the costs in their head. Was that ruby-encrusted goblet a gift, or a subtle reminder of debts owed? When a duke served wine from a vineyard recently seized from a rival, was it hospitality or a threat? The genius of medieval feasting lay in this duality. It allowed hosts to flex their power while maintaining plausible deniability. After all, who could accuse someone of intimidation when they were just offering the finest hospitality? This theatrical excess reached its peak in the late Middle Ages with the Burgundian dukes, who turned banquets into full-blown propaganda. At one feast, live birds were released from pies mid-meal, their wings dusted with edible gold. Another featured a mock naval battle staged in wine-filled trenches. These weren't parties, they were immersive theater, designed to leave guests so dazzled they'd forget to question the host's ambitions. In a world where perception shaped reality, controlling the spectacle meant controlling the narrative, and no stage was more persuasive than the banquet hall. If you think modern-day seating charts at weddings are stressful, medieval banquets took the politics of placement to an art form. Where you sat wasn't just about comfort, it was a public declaration of your standing in the court's invisible ledger of power. The high table, raised on a dais like a throne, wasn't merely practical. It transformed the host into a living emblem of authority, physically elevated above the murmuring crowd. To be invited to sit there wasn't an honor. It was a strategic appointment, a way for rulers to visually cement alliances or subtly demote rivals without uttering a word. Consider the scandal that erupted in 1387 when the Duke of Burgundy arrived at a French royal banquet, only to find his usual seat beside the king occupied by a rising court favorite. His reassignment to a lower table wasn't an oversight, it was a deliberate humiliation, sparking a feud that would eventually claim dozens of lives in retaliatory skirmishes. Such was the gravity of these spatial politics that heralds carried meticulously detailed seating plans, consulting them like battlefield maps before announcing each guest's position. Even the direction chairs faced held meaning. A lord might angle his seat toward a tapestry showing his recent military triumph, ensuring every bite his guests took happened beneath the shadow of his conquests. The closer one sat to the host, the brighter the glow of reflected power, but this privilege came with invisible strings. Those granted seats of honor were expected to reciprocate with loyalty, troops, or land concessions. Meanwhile, the lower tables functioned like a chessboard of potential. Ambitious nobles might find themselves seated beside influential clergy or wealthy merchants, their placement hinting at alliances the host wished to cultivate. Genius lay in the flexibility of this system. A king could flatter a restless vassal by suddenly promoting him to the high table, or isolate a troublemaker by seating them with known rivals. The arrangement was fluid enough to accommodate shifting loyalties but rigid enough to enforce hierarchy, a perfect metaphor for medieval power itself. And just like that, a simple act of deciding who sat where became one of history's most sophisticated tools of statecraft, all disguised as hospitality. In medieval halls, even the humblest loaf of bread could speak volumes. Food wasn't just sustenance, it was a sophisticated language where every ingredient and arrangement carried layers of political meaning. Take the boar's head, ceremoniously paraded into the banquet hall on a silver platter. This wasn't merely a culinary centerpiece. Its tusks and fierce expression served as an edible emblem of the host's military might. Serving such a dish declared, without uttering a word, that this was a ruler capable of protecting his lands and conquering others. But the real mastery lay in the subtler symbols. Salt, that precious commodity, often appeared in ornate communal cellars placed midway down the table. When a host gestured for guests to share from the same vessel, it wasn't just practicality, it was a public test of trust. To refuse might insult the entire assembly, while partaking bound you to the collective in ways more binding than any contract. The very legality of certain foods added another layer to this edible theater. Swan meat, for instance, was strictly reserved for royalty by English sumptuary laws. When a nobleman dared serve it at his table, he wasn't just showing off, he was staging a quiet rebellion, challenging the crown's authority bite by bite. Similarly, venison from the king's forests carried royal connotations. Serving it without permission was tantamount to treason, while receiving it as a gift signaled royal favor. Perhaps the most cunning example comes from 12th century Normandy, where a bishop hosted a feast during a tense standoff with local nobility, his masterstroke. Serving dolphin, a creature so rare inland that obtaining it required papal dispensation. As guests marveled at the exotic meat, the unspoken message rang clear. This clergyman had direct lines to Rome's highest circles. No threat needed, the fork did all the talking. Even the progression of courses followed a deliberate script. A meal might begin with lighter dishes symbolizing peace and diplomacy, then escalate to heavily spiced meats representing military vigor, culminating in sugar sculptures of fortresses or heraldic beasts, a none too subtle reminder of the host's resources. The true artistry lay in making these messages feel like generosity rather than intimidation, wrapping steel-fisted authority in velvet-gloved hospitality. By the time dessert arrived, guests had consumed far more than food. They'd swallowed an entire narrative of power, one meticulously crafted course after another. The clink of goblets in a medieval hall wasn't just festive noise, it was the sound of politics in liquid form. When nobles raised their cups, they weren't merely drinking, they were performing ceremonial alchemy, transforming wine into binding agreements. The act of toasting went far beyond good manners. It created a sacred space where words carried the weight of law, witnessed by all present. A shared drink became social glue, with participants literally ingesting the same substance as a symbolic act of unity. But like all power rituals, this one had teeth. Take the infamous treachery of Tours in the 8th century, where a Frankish count named Hatto publicly swore fealty to Charlemagne's son over a golden chalice. The wine had barely dried on their lips when Hatto rode straight to the rival Carolingian faction, his oath dissolved like the dregs at the bottom of his cup. Such betrayals led to the chilling practice of security toasts, where both parties drank from the same vessel, a silent dare that neither had poisoned the wine. The message was clear: trust might be fluid, but consequences were not. Yet refusing to participate was equally perilous. When the Duke of Brittany hesitated before toasting the French king in 1423, the entire hall fell silent. His momentary pause, whether from caution or defiance, sparked rumors of disloyalty that took years to dispel. This was the toast's dangerous duality. It forced nobles to choose between potential poison and certain political suicide. The real negotiations often happened after the formal toasts, when loosened tongues and blurred inhibitions created fertile ground for deal-making. Chroniclers describe how kings would wait until the 3rd or 4th round of drinks before proposing sensitive alliances, counting on alcohol's truth serum effect to reveal genuine loyalties. The Saxon ruler Henry the Fowler reportedly settled a bloody border dispute not in court or on the battlefield, but over barrels of honeyed mead, where his opponent's growing merriment signaled their willingness to compromise. What made these drinking rituals so effective was their veneer of spontaneity. A toast appeared voluntary, yet everyone understood the unspoken rules. The type of wine mattered. Serving a guest's regional vintage could flatter or mock, depending on context. The order of toasts mapped the court's pecking order with brutal clarity. Even the vessel held meaning. Drinking from the host's personal cup implied intimacy, while receiving a lesser goblet might hint at waning favor. Perhaps the most brilliant aspect was how these liquid oaths exploited medieval honor culture. Breaking a sworn vow made over wine wasn't just politically inconvenient. It rendered a noble spiritually unclean in the eyes of the church and socially untrustworthy among peers. The wine itself became a character in these dramas, its rich color echoing the blood that might soon be spilled if agreements shattered. In this world, every raised cup was a gamble, every sip a potential turning point, proof that some of history's most pivotal moments happened not in council chambers, but in the hazy, wine-soaked hours after the last course was cleared. Amidst the clatter of dishes and the murmur of political scheming, medieval banquets featured another weapon in the host's arsenal: entertainment that could sway hearts and humiliate enemies with equal precision. While jesters appeared to tumble about in harmless folly, their jokes were often carefully crafted darts aimed at the host's rivals, wrapped in the protective veil of humor. A well-placed quip about a nobleman's failed harvest or a thinly veiled jab at a duke's battlefield missteps could land with the precision of an archer's arrow, leaving the target seething but powerless to retaliate without looking like a humorless brute. Minstrels held even greater influence, their ballads serving as the era's viral propaganda. When Edward III wanted to drum up enthusiasm for his campaigns in France, he didn't just rely on dry proclamations. He hired minstrels to weave tales of English valor into catchy refrains. Guests leaving his feasts would find themselves humming songs that painted the king as an unstoppable conqueror, their toes tapping along to rhythms that subtly reinforced his right to rule. These performers weren't mere background noise. They were psychological operatives, turning melodies into loyalty oaths. Then there were the elaborate mummery plays, where masked actors reenacted recent battles or political dramas with a twist. Imagine watching a crude but unmistakable parody of your own failed rebellion, performed before the very court you'd tried to overthrow. The laughter of your peers became your punishment, the applause a public ratification of your defeat. Some hosts took this even further, like the Duke of Milan, who staged a mock coronation for a rival during dessert, only to have the crown collapse into crumbs, reducing the man's ambitions to literal dust. The brilliance of this entertainment lay in its deniability. If confronted, a host could shrug off an insulting skit as harmless fun, or claim a minstrel's lyrics were just artistic license. But everyone in that hall understood the real score. The jester's bells rang with the same authority as a herald's trumpet, and a well-sung ballad could do more to secure a king's legacy than a dozen won battles. In the end, the most dangerous performers weren't the sword swallowers or fire eaters. They were the ones who made politics palatable, wrapping ruthless messages in the irresistible sugar of spectacle. Beneath the veneer of generosity, medieval gift-giving was a high-stakes dance of obligation and strategy, that jeweled dagger presented with a smile. Not just a trinket, it was a contract written in gold and rubies, binding the receiver to future loyalty. Consider the case of the Duke of Burgundy, who famously gifted a magnificent Arabian stallion to a rival lord's teenage son. On the surface, it appeared as a harmless gesture to a young noble, but the unspoken terms were clear. This extravagant present created a debt that would one day be called in, perhaps for troops or political support. Some gifts were so deliberately tailored they functioned as psychological warfare. When Italian diplomats presented the Holy Roman Emperor with a clockwork automaton, a marvel of engineering that moved with lifelike precision, they weren't just showcasing craftsmanship. The intricate gears mirrored the complex trade negotiations they sought to advance, implying that just as the machine required careful handling, so too did their commercial relationship. The emperor got a fascinating toy, the Italians got reduced tariffs, yet rejecting these offerings was often more dangerous than accepting them. A chronicle from 1293 describes how an English earl triggered a bloody feud by returning a gifted silver chalice, its refusal interpreted as a slap to the donor's honor. This created the perfect trap. Nobles found themselves caught between swallowing poisoned favors or risking open conflict. Even the wrapping carried meaning. Silk from Constantinople or ivory boxes from Cordoba amplified the implied worth of the obligation. The most cunning hosts exploited this system by staging public gift exchanges. Imagine the scene. A vassal presents his lord with an ornate sword during the banquet's climax, the entire court watching as the ruler graciously accepts. The performance obligated the giver to continued loyalty while allowing the recipient to demonstrate his magnanimity. What looked like spontaneous generosity was actually political theater, with each actor knowing their lines by heart. Perhaps no artifact captures this delicate power play better than the legendary Salt Cellar of Naples, a solid gold masterpiece gifted by one king to another. Its surface was engraved not with decorative patterns, but with tiny maps of disputed borderlands, a not-so-subtle suggestion wrapped in the guise of a diplomatic present. The recipient faced an impossible choice: keep it and tacitly acknowledge territorial claims, or reject it and spark immediate hostilities. In the banquet hall's glittering light, even tableware became territory. In the flickering torchlight of a 15th-century banquet hall, a single toast could rewrite the map of Europe. When the Duke of Burgundy raised his goblet to announce his daughter's betrothal to a Habsburg prince at the Feast of the Golden Rose, the guests weren't just celebrating a marriage, they were witnessing the birth of a political superpower. The clinking of cups echoed like the sealing of a treaty, as sugared almonds stamped with both families' crests circulated through the crowd, edible symbols of an alliance that would shape the continent for generations. These engagement feasts were less about romance than ruthless calculus. Take the infamous case of the Spanish Infanta, whose potential marriage to an English king crumbled over a single meal. Chroniclers whisper that the princess's refusal to sample the roast swan, considered a delicacy, was interpreted as an insult, her delicate nibbling at bread seen as weakness. What modern eyes might dismiss as picky eating, medieval courts read as damning evidence of unfit lineage. Every sip of wine, every gesture with a napkin, became a test of bloodline and breeding under the scrutiny of dozens of ambassadors playing royal matchmakers. The sheer extravagance of these betrothal banquets served as dynastic credit checks. When the Holy Roman Emperor hosted a feast for his sons intended in 1481, the walls were hung with tapestries woven from gold thread, while live fish swam in crystal bowls at each table, proof that his treasury could sustain future grandchildren. Meanwhile, the Medici family turned engagement parties into multimedia spectacles, hiring poets to recite verses comparing the couple's union to mythical alliances of gods, subtly elevating their merchant origins to near royal status through the power of storytelling and sugar sculpture. Behind the scenes, these celebrations functioned as high-stakes inspection tours. A French prince's delegation once arrived days early to secretly assess the bride's castle larders, counting smoked hams and barrels of wine like bankers reviewing collateral. More than one marriage contract included clauses about the exact number of dishes to be served at the wedding feast, not as hospitality, but as legally binding evidence of the family's resources. Perhaps the most brilliant maneuver was how these feasts transformed cold political deals into emotional events. When the Polish Princess Jadwiga was wed to Lithuania's Grand Duke in 1386, the banquet featured a towering cake shaped like the two nations' intertwined coats of arms, a sugary metaphor that helped sell the union to skeptical nobles. The shared act of cutting the cake became performance art, making geopolitical necessity feel like celebration. In the end, these weren't just parties, they were the original power couples, where every toasted health and exchanged sweetmeat whispered the same truth. Dynasties aren't born in battlefields or chanceries, but over banquet tables laid with edible diplomacy. Even the holiest dietary restrictions couldn't escape the political theater of medieval feasting. What appeared as simple piety often concealed power plays sharper than any carving knife. Take the case of Pope Innocent III, who turned a Lenten banquet into a masterclass in psychological warfare. When a particularly zealous cardinal criticized papal luxuries during the fasting season, Innocent didn't argue. He hosted a lavish feast where the miraculous abundance of rare fish species left guests whispering about divine approval. The message was deliciously clear. If God himself provided sturgeon and lampreys for the Pope's table, who were mere mortals to question it, this culinary chess game worked both ways. A German chronicle from 1242 describes how Emperor Frederick II, no stranger to controversy, deliberately scheduled his coronation banquet during Holy Week, forcing pious nobles to choose between their souls and their sovereign. Those who attended risked clerical condemnation, while those who abstained found their lands mysteriously reassigned. The emperor's kitchens became an extension of his chancery, with roasted meats serving as edible loyalty tests. The real genius of these dietary power plays lay in their plausible deniability. When English barons under King John suddenly developed religious scruples about eating the royal venison, their devout refusal was actually a coordinated protest against his tyranny, one that didn't technically violate feudal oaths. Similarly, the French Duke of Berry once humiliated a rival by sending him a single herring during carnival season, its meagerness contrasting painfully with the ducal tables groaning under roast boar. The insult carried precisely because everyone understood the language of Lenten deprivation. Perhaps no moment captures this holy gastropolitics better than the Council of Constance in 1417. As rival popes jockeyed for legitimacy, their supporters engaged in competitive fasting not for spiritual merit, but to prove whose faction bore God's favor through their ability to endure hunger. Banquet halls became theological battlegrounds where the absence of food spoke louder than its presence, and where a bishop's refusal of butter could shake kingdoms as surely as any army. In this world, even asceticism was a performance, and every empty plate told a story. The clatter of dishes and the swell of drunken laughter in a medieval banquet hall created the perfect cover for history's most audacious spies. While guests assumed they were among allies, every serving boy with a wine jug, every demure maiden offering sweetmeats, might be a trained observer recording their careless words. In an age before wiretaps or encrypted letters, the banquet table became the ultimate intelligence-gathering operation where the best spies weren't lurking in shadows, but carrying trays in plain sight. Take Elizabeth I's court, where her spymaster Francis Walsingham turned hospitality into a surveillance state. His agents disguised as cupbearers would linger just a moment too long near inebriated nobles, their trained ears catching treasonous murmurs about Catholic plots or Spanish alliances. One such servant, recorded only as the man with the green sleeve, reportedly uncovered 3 assassination attempts simply by refilling goblets at strategic intervals. The wine wasn't just social lubrication, it was an interrogation tool, loosening tongues with every sip. Across the continent, the Byzantines elevated this art to near scientific precision. Their silent servers, chosen for acute hearing and ability to read lips, moved through feasts like ghosts. A chronicle from Emperor Constantine VII's reign describes how these unobtrusive observers could reconstruct entire conversations from the twitch of a mustache or the way a guest's fingers tightened around their knife when certain topics arose. Some were even trained in the language of napkins, a code where folding or staining linen signaled which guests required closer scrutiny. But the real masters of culinary espionage were the Venetians. Their ambassadors' banquets featured a specialty called spying pies, hollow pastries with a center compartment where servants could hide letters or maps stolen during the meal's chaos. A well-timed stumble could send a platter crashing to the floor, creating just enough distraction to swap one document for another. The infamous Doge's Feast of 1492 saw 6 secret treaties change hands this way, all while musicians played loudly enough to mask the rustling of parchment. What made these tactics so effective was their deniability. A lord whose plans were discovered couldn't cry foul without admitting he'd been speaking treason or that he'd been outwitted by a lowly scullion. The system preyed on medieval hierarchy's blind spot. Nobles rarely noticed the servants moving around them, just as fish don't notice the water. By the time dessert arrived, every whispered confidence, every drunken boast had already been carried to waiting ears behind the tapestry. The greatest feasts weren't just displays of power, they were traps laid with porcelain and garnished with deception. The goblet passed from hand to hand, its ruby liquid catching the candlelight, a seemingly innocent gesture of trust in a world where every sip could be your last. While medieval banquets dazzled with their opulence, they also provided the perfect stage for history's most chilling act, murder disguised as hospitality. The Borgia family elevated this dark art to legend. Their infamous cantarella, poison, a concoction of arsenic and putrid flesh concealed in sweet Malmsey wine. When Cardinal Orsini collapsed after toasting with Rodrigo Borgia in 1498, the whispered explanation was bad shellfish. But those in the know recognized the signature move of a family who treated dinner invitations like death warrants. Poison wasn't just a tool for eliminating enemies, it was psychological warfare. Clever hosts would sometimes spike a single dish, then watch in satisfaction as guests nervously eyed each other, wondering who had drawn the fatal portion. The terror lingered long after the meal, turning every future banquet into an exercise in paranoia. Emperor Claudius learned this too well when his trusted food taster, the eunuch Helotus, accidentally served him a plate of deadly mushrooms in 54 AD. The official story blamed careless foraging, but Tacitus hints the real culprit was Claudius's wife Agrippina, securing the throne for her son Nero. Some rulers turned the tables, employing elaborate defenses that would put modern security to shame. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios Komnenos kept a menagerie of taster animals, peacocks, monkeys, even a prized white stag that sampled his food in hierarchical order. If the stag fell first, the dish was doubly cursed. Others used science. The Medici family commissioned poison-detecting goblets made from rare stones believed to sweat or change color when toxins were present. Yet the most insidious poison was often the waiting game. A slow-acting substance like mercury could mimic natural illness over months, allowing the perpetrator to mourn publicly while privately counting down the days. When King John of England suspiciously lost his appetite and died in 1216 after a feast with rebellious barons, chroniclers noted his symptoms matched monkshood poisoning, an herb conveniently growing in the castle gardens. The perfect crime left no dagger drawn, no blood spilled, just a body and a banquet room full of plausible deniability. What made these culinary assassinations so effective was their ambiguity. In an age before toxicology reports, death could always be attributed to bad humors or divine judgment, a nobleman collapsing after third helpings. Clearly a glutton punished by God, a rival clutching his stomach after your wine, the hazards of rich living. The banquet table became the original courtroom, where the verdict was delivered not by jury, but by digestion, and where the most dangerous guests weren't those who refused to eat, but those who watched you take the first bite. When kings needed to wage war without drawing swords, they laid out silverware instead. The grandest medieval feasts doubled as clandestine diplomatic summits, where the clatter of plates masked delicate negotiations and every course carried the weight of international relations. Take the legendary Field of the Cloth of Gold in 1520, a spectacle so extravagant it required the construction of an entire temporary palace straddling the English and French borders. Henry VIII and Francis I didn't just share meals, they engaged in edible one-upmanship, each trying to bankrupt the other through sheer magnificence. Henry's chefs prepared 2,200 sheep and a fountain flowing with red wine, while Francis countered with a pastry chef who sculpted his castle in marzipan complete with edible cannons pointed toward the English tents. What appeared as friendly hospitality was actually soft power warfare, where the real battles were fought over who could serve the most absurdly luxurious dessert. But beyond the theatrics, these diplomatic dinners operated on razor-sharp subtleties. Serving mutton to a Scottish delegation wasn't just poor menu planning. It invoked centuries of border raids where English soldiers stole flocks, guaranteeing instant offense. Presenting pork to Muslim diplomats didn't just breach religious customs. It was a calculated insult suggesting their beliefs weren't worth accommodating. Even the placement of salt cellars held significance. When the Holy Roman Emperor hosted Venetian envoys, he positioned the salt near his plate, but out of their reach, a silent reminder of who controlled the Adriatic trade routes. The tableware itself became a propaganda tool. French kings famously insisted on using gold plates when entertaining German dignitaries, flaunting their superior mining wealth. Meanwhile, Spanish hosts would serve New World delicacies like chocolate on Aztec-style ceramic platters, a not-so-subtle flex about their colonial empire. These weren't aesthetic choices, they were edible maps of influence, broadcasting military reach and economic dominance without a single boast. Some feasts avoided outright confrontation through clever culinary diplomacy. When Mongol envoys arrived at European courts, wary hosts served horse meat, a staple of steppe diets, to ease tensions. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII disarmed Arab ambassadors by presenting dishes on revolving silver towers, allowing guests to sample everything without awkward reaching. These gestures of cultural fluency often achieved what months of negotiations couldn't, turning potential enemies into trading partners over shared appreciation for perfectly spiced lamb. Yet the greatest power move was knowing when not to feast at all. The Ottomans mastered this by hosting austere, working meals for Christian diplomats, simple pilaf eaten while standing, to underscore their discipline compared to decadent Europeans. Conversely, Polish nobles once crushed a Teutonic delegation's demands by prolonging a banquet for 3 days straight until the sleep-deprived knights signed whatever was put before them. Whether through extravagant indulgence or strategic deprivation, medieval rulers understood that the path to a rival's surrender didn't necessarily lead through a battlefield. It could just as easily win through a banquet hall, where the sharpest weapons were serving platters and the deadliest strikes came flavored with saffron and honey. Sometimes the most dangerous spark wasn't a torch or a sword. It was the sight of a nobleman licking grease from his fingers while children starved outside the castle gates. Medieval history brims with moments when a single ill-timed feast became the tipping point for rebellion, proving that nothing fuels rage faster than the smell of roasting meat when your own belly aches with hunger. Consider the infamous Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Which didn't begin with a battle cry, but with the sound of a tax collector's laughter echoing from a barn where he'd commandeered a farmer's last pig to host a drunken feast. As villagers watched through cracks in the wood, their resentment crystallized into action within days. Manors across England burned not because of taxation itself, but because the ruling class had rubbed their faces in it. Yet feasts could also be the rebels' secret weapon. The gunpowder plotters didn't huddle in shadowy cellars to finalize their scheme. They disguised their conspiracy as a hunting banquet in 1605, passing notes between courses of venison pie. The very normality of the gathering provided perfect cover. Who would suspect treasonous talk amid the clatter of pewter plates and bawdy drinking songs? Even the servers were in on it, using wine refills as signals. A full goblet meant a conspirator had arrived, while an overturned cup warned of approaching strangers. The most visceral rebellions often targeted the banquet symbols rather than the people themselves. During Jack Cade's uprising in 1450, rebels didn't just storm London, they stormed the king's larder, smashing his prized gold plates and scattering the fragments like breadcrumbs for the poor. Each shattered dish was a deliberate act of political theater. If the king's wealth could be reduced to shards under a cobbler's boot, so too could his divine right to rule. Similar scenes played out in the German Peasants' War, where revolting farmers didn't merely seize castles. They seated themselves at the high table, carving meat with the lord's own knife before distributing it to the crowd. These weren't random acts of vandalism. They were carefully staged performances proving that power could be as fragile as Venetian glass. What made these edible insurrections so potent was their simplicity. A starving peasant might not understand Latin decrees or heraldic proclamations, but everyone grasped the meaning of a noble's silver spoon. When French revolutionaries later paraded through Versailles with the Queen's cake plates on pikes, they were following a playbook written centuries earlier, one where the table, not the throne, became the ultimate battleground. In the end, the most lasting revolutions often began not with a manifesto, but with the scent of injustice wafting from an overloaded banquet table. While kings and dukes jockeyed for position in the Great Hall, some of medieval Europe's most cunning political maneuvers unfolded in far more intimate settings, the private chambers of noblewomen who mastered the art of hosting. Take Elena of Aquitaine's infamous salon suppers, where the Queen of England and France gathered hand-picked guests around carved oak tables draped in Flemish linen. Here, away from the posturing of male courts, alliances were sealed not with booming toasts but with murmured confidences over spiced wine. A bishop might find himself seated beside a rebellious baron's wife, their shared appreciation for honeyed figs paving the way for pardons. A young heiress could be strategically placed next to a widowed count, her demure sips of hippocras doing more to advance the marriage negotiations than any formal proposal. What made these gatherings so potent was their plausible deniability. When Marguerite of Provence brokered peace between her warring husband and brother-in-law in 1259, the official treaty was signed weeks later, but the real work happened over candied violets in her solar, where neither man risked losing face by conceding in public. Noblewomen leveraged their role as hostesses to create a political gray zone. A promise made after the third course of roast quail could later be dismissed as mere dinner conversation if circumstances changed. Convents became unexpected hubs for this soft power feasting. Abbesses like Hildegard of Bingen hosted lavish meals for visiting bishops, their vows of poverty conveniently suspended when strategic alliances were at stake. The key was in the details, serving fine white bread while discussing monastery lands, or presenting imported oranges alongside requests for papal dispensations. One 13th century chronicle describes how the abbess of Quedlinburg settled a bitter property dispute by serving the bishop a trout from the contested river, its delicate flesh a silent argument for her claim. The true brilliance of these female-led feasts lay in their flexibility. While men's banquets followed rigid protocols, noblewomen could adapt on the fly. A sudden change in dessert, say, replacing expected pairs with a suitor's regional specialty, might nudge negotiations in a new direction. Even the decor played its part. Tapestries depicting strong biblical heroines or floral arrangements featuring a rival family's heraldic colors sent messages without a word spoken. Perhaps the most striking example comes from 15th century Burgundy, where Duchess Isabella hosted weekly, literary dinners that were actually elaborate intelligence networks. Poets recited verses laced with political allegories, while ladies-in-waiting noted which nobles laughed too loudly at anti-English couplets. The guest list itself was a masterclass in psychological manipulation, excluding someone's spouse-implied trust, while seating two feuding families side by side forced civility. In the end, these women proved that political influence didn't always require a seat at the high table. Sometimes it flowed most freely through the discreet clink of goblets in a candlelit chamber, where the hostess controlled both the menu and the narrative. Their legacy reminds us that history's most pivotal deals weren't just struck in council chambers or on battlefields, they were seasoned with saffron and served with a side of subtlety, one carefully curated course at a time. The shimmering illusion of endless wealth could prove more valuable than actual gold in the medieval world, a lesson rulers like Louis IX of France understood all too well. When the young king hosted his coronation banquet in 1226, the feast lasted 8 days straight, featuring 2 roasted oxen daily, exotic peacocks stuffed with almonds, and enough wine to float a small ship. The cost nearly drained the royal treasury, yet Louis considered it money well spent. In an era where perception shaped reality, a single magnificent feast could cement a monarch's reputation for abundance, discouraging challengers who might mistake extravagance for invincibility. The Burgundian feast of 1468 took this logic to dizzying heights. Duke Charles the Bold commissioned a banquet so lavish that scribes ran out of parchment documenting its excesses. Live doves bursting from pies, a sugar replica of the ducal castle large enough for children to walk through, and a river of spiced wine flowing through the hall. The event bankrupted his duchy's annual budget, yet the gamble paid off in unexpected ways. Centuries later, historians still reference the Burgundian splendor as shorthand for opulence, proving that while gold coins vanish, legends endure. The Duke's creditors might have grumbled, but his name became synonymous with power, a currency that never depreciated. Yet not all rulers feasted blindly. The Medici family approached banquets with the precision of bankers, which, of course, they were. When Cosimo de' Medici hosted dinners for Florentine elites, every gilded platter served dual purposes. The imported Venetian glassware wasn't just pretty, it demonstrated access to trade networks that reassured investors. Serving lamb roasted with rare Eastern spices hinted at connections to lucrative Silk Road deals. Even the timing mattered. A well-placed feast during tax season could soften reluctant patrons into extending loans. Their banquets functioned like modern prospectuses, where the roast peacock's plumage was just another column in the ledger. The true mastery lay in balancing risk and reward. King John II of Portugal famously sold crown jewels to fund a farewell banquet for explorers departing to India in 1497. Critics called it madness until those explorers returned with shiploads of pepper, repaying the cost 100-fold. Meanwhile, the Habsburgs perfected the art of deficit feasting, hosting ever grander meals while quietly borrowing from the same bankers seated at their tables. Their genius was making debt look like dominion, proving that sometimes the quickest way to fill a treasury was to first empty it spectacularly. In the end, these rulers understood something profound. Medieval economics wasn't just about balancing books, it was about balancing perceptions. A single night's excess could attract dowries, secure loans, or intimidate rivals more effectively than any army. The accounts might show red ink, but the real profit was measured in whispers, the awed murmurs of guests who would spend lifetimes repaying the privilege of having witnessed such magnificence. In the cutthroat theater of medieval dining, even the way you held your knife could determine whether you left the hall as an ally or a laughingstock. Etiquette wasn't about politeness, it was a coded language of power, where every gesture broadcast your pedigree or betrayed your peasant roots. Take the humble dining knife. While commoners sawed at their meat with shared blades, nobles carried personalized daggers, often jeweled with their coat of arms. To eat from a communal knife wasn't just unsanitary, it was social suicide, marking you as someone who couldn't afford your own steel. The arrival of the fork from Byzantium in the 11th century sparked a revolution more divisive than any heresy. When a Venetian noblewoman first used the two-pronged implement at her wedding feast, clergy denounced it as devil's vanity, while forward-thinking lords rushed to adopt it as a badge of sophistication. Within decades, forks became the ultimate litmus test. Traditionalists clinging to fingers were dismissed as backwards, while those who mastered the delicate art of spearing food signaled their connection to cosmopolitan courts. Kings quickly weaponized these nuances. When Edward III of England noticed his barons wiping greasy hands on tablecloths, he commissioned illuminated etiquette manuals not to improve hygiene but to humiliate. Suddenly, lords who'd spent lifetimes conquering castles found themselves struggling with spoon angles and napkin folds. their battlefield prowess meaningless against the silent judgment of a correctly folded swan-shaped serviette. The most cunning rulers turned mealtime into a minefield of manufactured faux pas. A French duke once seated a troublesome vassal beneath a tapestry depicting proper dining postures, ensuring every clumsy bite was measured against the woven ideal. Another host deliberately provided oversized goblets to visiting nobles, knowing their spilled wine would become the evening's gossip. Even bodily functions became political. Where a peasant might spit bones on the floor, a noble learned to discreetly deposit them in a discard bowl, or risk being labeled uncouth by ambassadors taking notes. What made these rituals so effective was their invisibility. Unlike laws or taxes, manners couldn't be openly resisted without admitting one's own coarseness. When a German margrave protested the new elbow rule keeping arms off tables, his peers smirked his very complaint, proving him unfit for refined company. Thus did kings civilize their courts not with swords but with salad forks, transforming rebellion into self-consciousness and dissent into desperate imitation. The message was clear: in the game of power, sometimes the most lethal weapon is a well-polished spoon. Timing a feast wasn't left to chance in the medieval world. It was a precision instrument, wielded with the same care as a surgeon's scalpel. Rulers understood that hosting a banquet after the autumn harvest wasn't just practical. It transformed their halls into living ledgers of prosperity. Picture the scene: carts overflowing with freshly milled grain, barrels of apples still glistening with orchard dew, and sides of beef from cattle fattened on summer pastures. This wasn't mere abundance, it was theater, designed to imprint one undeniable fact on every guest's mind. This lord's lands yielded more, his peasants worked harder, and his coffers would remain full through the lean winter months. The Saxon kings took this further, timing their great mead feasts to coincide with the slaughter season, when salt-cured hams and smoked sausages hung from every rafter like edible trophies of good governance. But scarcity could be just as powerful a tool as surplus. When the French king Philip the Fair hosted a Lenten banquet in 1306, the absence of meat spoke louder than any roast boar. By serving elaborate fish dishes on days of mandated abstinence, think pike poached in almond milk or eel pies gilded with edible silver, he demonstrated both piety and privilege. Only a ruler with access to far-flung fisheries and spice routes could turn fasting into flamboyance. The Duke of Brittany twisted this further, deliberately holding his Lenten feasts near starving fishing villages, where the sight of his court dining on salmon and sturgeon reinforced the brutal hierarchy of hunger. Astrology and superstition lent their weight to these culinary calendars. Charles V's decision to stage his coronation feast beneath a streaking comet in 1519 wasn't just spectacle, it transformed celestial coincidence into divine endorsement. Guests whispering about the ominous portent found their fears silenced by court astronomers declaring it God's own celebration banner. Similarly, the English King Henry VI timed his wedding banquet to align with a rare planetary conjunction, hiring scholars to circulate parchments, proving the stars blessed his union. Winter feasts became the ultimate power flex, their roaring hearths and torchlit halls staging a deliberate rebellion against nature's austerity. While peasants subsisted on root cellars and salted fish, nobles flaunted tables piled with citrus fruits shipped from Moorish Spain or honey cakes made with spices that had traveled farther than most knights. The Burgundian dukes took this to extremes, hosting 12-day Yuletide feasts where each course represented a different month. Fresh strawberries in December, lamb in February, a brazen lie of perpetual summer that nonetheless awed visitors into submission. The true masters of seasonal strategy were the Medici popes, who turned Easter banquets into geopolitical chessboards. By serving lamb roasted with artichokes, a vegetable then only grown in Ottoman-controlled Cyprus, they signaled both their global reach and their willingness to engage with Muslim rulers. Meanwhile, the Venetian doges hosted autumn seafood extravaganzas just as rival city-states' fishing fleets were docked for winter, their tables groaning with oysters and sea bream while competitors nibbled on preserved herring. These weren't arbitrary dates circled on a calendar, but psychological operations disguised as merriment. A well-timed feast could make subjects forget a failed harvest, intimidate ambassadors with displays of unnatural abundance, or reframe astronomical events as heavenly endorsements. The lesson was clear. In the hands of a clever ruler, even the turning of seasons could be weaponized, and the most potent political statements were often served seasonally with a side of strategic spectacle. The towering vaults of a medieval banquet hall didn't just impress, they manipulated. Every arch, every shadow, even the texture of the stone underfoot was calibrated to reinforce one unshakable truth: the host held all the power. Take Westminster's cavernous Great Hall, where Richard II commissioned a table stretching 60 feet, not for practicality, but as a psychological moat. Guests seated at the far end had to shout to be heard, their conspiratorial whispers swallowed by the space, while the king's voice, amplified by the curved apse behind his dais, rolled over them like thunder. This wasn't architecture, it was acoustic domination. Clever rulers exploited sightlines as ruthlessly as battlements. The high table's elevation wasn't just about visibility, it forced guests to crane their necks upward, a physical reminder of their subordinate status. At Kenilworth Castle, John of Gaunt went further, installing narrow lancet windows that funneled sunlight directly onto his seat while leaving visitors in gloom. The message was primal. He basked in divine light while others lingered in obscurity. Even the floor played its part. Herringbone brickwork in Burgundian halls subtly directed footsteps toward the host, ensuring no approach went unnoticed. But the real masterstroke was turning the walls themselves into spies. Hidden within the ornate carvings of Stirling Castle's hall, listening tubes, narrow conduits disguised as decorative moldings allowed servants to eavesdrop on conversations and report back. Similar tricks appeared in Venetian palaces, where strategically placed air vents carried whispers straight to the Doge's chambers. Some hosts took surveillance further. The Duke of Milan's hall featured a balcony where masked observers could watch guests unobserved, their judgments as silent and inescapable as the frescoed saints glaring down from the ceiling. The chilling genius of these designs lay in their deniability. A lord could claim his towering hall was simply grand, the raised dais traditional, the echoing acoustics an accident of stone. But every noble who ever strained to hear their neighbors' mutterings or felt their voice falter in the vastness understood the truth. These weren't buildings but instruments of control. When the French King Philip Augustus rebuilt the Louvre's Great Hall, he specified ceiling beams carved with his royal fleur-de-lis, positioned so that anyone glancing upward for relief from his scrutiny would meet another relentless reminder of his authority. Perhaps no space weaponized architecture more brutally than Eltham Palace's hall, where Henry VIII installed a hidden gallery behind linen-fold paneling. From this shadowed perch, he could watch his courtiers' unguarded moments who drank too freely, who exchanged glances, who picked at their food nervously. The lesson was clear. In the medieval world, even the walls had ears, and every feast was staged in a gilded cage. Nothing shattered medieval society's illusions of permanence like the Black Death. Yet in the face of mass graves and abandoned villages, the banquet halls of the wealthy became theaters of defiant excess. As corpses piled high in the streets of Florence and London, nobles responded not with fasting, but with feasts so grotesquely extravagant they bordered on blasphemy. The infamous Dance Macabre feast of 1349 in Avignon turned morbidity into spectacle. Servers dressed as skeletal reapers offered platters of roasted songbirds, each tiny carcass a mockery of the pestilence devouring Europe outside the castle walls. Guests drank from goblets engraved with their own coats of arms alongside hourglasses, a macabre joke about status meaning nothing in death's queue. This wasn't mere hedonism, it was psychological warfare against despair. When the Archbishop of Canterbury hosted a 12-course banquet during London's worst outbreak, his menu included live frogs baked into pies, symbolizing plague boils bursting, and wine mixed with powdered gemstones advertised as divine immunity. The message to terrified onlookers was clear: those God truly favored would never taste death's bitterness. Even as priests condemned these displays, desperate populations clung to the spectacle like a lifeline. If the nobility could still feast, perhaps order hadn't completely unraveled. Meanwhile, an unprecedented social revolution unfolded course by course. With entire noble lines wiped out, wealthy merchants staged status banquets where they literally consumed their newfound power. A Florentine wool trader turned condottiere named Francesco Di Marco left records of his 1348 Ascension Feast, a meticulously planned event where each dish symbolized a step up the social ladder. Hors d'oeuvres of black bread represented his peasant origins, while the main course of gilded peacock, traditionally reserved for knights, announced his purchased title. The Pièce de Résistance, a sugar sculpture of his former master's crumbling castle, which guests were encouraged to smash and consume. The plague years also birthed one of history's most chilling dining trends, the memento mori menu. Hosts in Germany and Burgundy served meals on trenchers carved from coffin wood, with centerpieces featuring clockwork skeletons that slowly turned to face each guest during dessert. One surviving account from a Metz banquet describes how servants circulated silver platters bearing the names of recently deceased nobles. Invitees were expected to spit on them before courses were served. This wasn't just gallows humor, it was a brutal reminder that every attendee owed their seat to someone else's misfortune. Yet perhaps the darkest irony lay in how the plague reshaped dining logistics. With half the peasantry dead, surviving workers could demand higher wages, meaning nobles now paid more for their feast's ingredients while their lands produced less income. The solution: even grander displays of waste. When King Edward III hosted a post-plague tournament banquet, he ordered 200 casks of spoiled wine dumped into the Thames just to prove he could absorb the loss. The scent of vinegar mixing with the river's usual stench became a perverse status symbol, advertising that some fortunes remained untouched by death's leveling hand. In the end, these banquets revealed a universal truth about power. When faced with the uncontrollable, the elite don't retreat, they double down. The Black Death didn't humble medieval nobility. It drove them to construct ever more elaborate fantasies of invincibility, one grotesque course at a time. Their tables became the last bastion against chaos, where the rich could pretend, if only for an evening, that gold and spice might hold back the reaper's scythe. Cookbooks in the medieval world were never just collections of recipes. They were edible manifestos, bound in vellum and seasoned with political ambition. Take the form of curry, commissioned by Richard II's master cooks in 1390. At first glance, it reads like a lavish menu: spiced venison, almond milk custards, saffron-infused broths. But dig deeper, and each dish becomes a declaration of dominance. When Richard's chefs included Saracen stew or Moorish figs, they weren't merely borrowing flavors, they were staging a culinary conquest, asserting that even the spices and techniques of distant lands now bowed to English mastery. A king's kitchen, it turned out, could redraw borders as effectively as his armies. The brilliance of these cookbooks lay in their subtlety. Unlike battle trophies or seized crowns, recipes carried the quiet authority of everyday life. By renaming a Persian lamb dish as Prince's Roast or adapting Arab sugar techniques into royal comforts, European rulers performed a kind of gastronomic colonialism. Every time a noblewoman served Saracen bread at her table, she wasn't just feeding guests, she was reiterating that the cultures that inspired it were now subjects, their culinary heritage reduced to exotic curiosities on Christian platters. Nor were these books meant for actual cooks. Their elaborate ingredients, peacock tongues, gilded loaves, spices worth a peasant's yearly wage, were less practical instructions than aspirational propaganda. When the Duke of Berry's Lavinia described a pie that released live birds, the goal wasn't to teach baking, it was to dazzle readers with the Duke's boundless resources. These manuscripts circulated among elites like edible bragging rights, their impossibly lavish recipes serving the same function as modern arms races, proof that no rival could match such extravagance. Even the act of compiling recipes became political theater. The Libra del Coq, written for King Ferdinand of Aragon, didn't just catalogue dishes, it erased entire cultures. Moorish and Jewish culinary traditions, dominant in Spain for centuries, were rebranded as Christian fare, their origins scrubbed cleaner than a well-scoured pot. Meanwhile, the Vatican's cookbooks emphasized austerity in theory, while listing ingredients so rare they mocked the very piety they pretended to uphold. What made these culinary texts so effective was their veneer of innocence. A battle standard could be captured, a tax roll burned, but a well-distributed cookbook seeped into the fabric of daily life. When a German housewife prepared Hungarian-style chicken from a Habsburg-sponsored manuscript, she unknowingly rehearsed imperial claims over Budapest. As for Richard II, his form of curry outlived his turbulent reign, its pages continuing to whisper long after his deposition. This is what it means to rule, and this is how far our reach extends, one stolen recipe at a time. When Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door, he unknowingly launched a culinary revolution that would turn banquet tables into theological battlegrounds. The Protestant Reformation didn't just challenge papal authority, it declared war on centuries of Catholic feasting traditions. Suddenly, the lavish Saint-Day banquets that once filled church calendars became symbols of excess, replaced by Lutheran, modest suppers where plain bread and beer stood as edible sermons on simplicity. But Catholic rulers fought back with forks raised high, turning their dining halls into defiant stages for orthodoxy. In Munster, 1546 saw dessert escalate into bloodshed when Protestant bakers crafted marzipan wafers mimicking communion hosts, a direct challenge to Catholic Eucharistic doctrine. Catholic bakers retaliated with plain bread sculptures, sparking a riot that left sugar paste and sanctity trampled underfoot. The stakes went deeper than symbolism. When Protestant cities abolished meatless Fridays, Catholic princes responded by hosting extravagant Friday fish banquets, not just to obey church law, but to flaunt it. A single serving of pike in cream sauce became a political act, proof that Rome's authority still held sway. Meanwhile, Lutheran nobles distilled their rebellion into drinking rituals, toasting with beer instead of wine to reject the papist association of vineyards with sacrament. Even tableware got ideological. Protestant households displayed simple pewter to signal humility, while Catholic elites commissioned chalice-like goblets engraved with scenes of the Last Supper. The most cunning battles were fought through guest lists. A Protestant count might invite Catholic neighbors to a deliberately bland meal, no spices, no sweets, to showcase virtuous austerity. Catholic hosts retaliated by seating Protestant delegates beneath tapestries of the damned choking at hell's banquet, their wine served in glasses painted with subtle crucifixion scenes. The message was clear: reform your plate and you risked your soul. Yet amid the theatrics, real social change simmered. Protestant rejection of fasting laws inadvertently boosted Northern Europe's herring trade, while Catholic regions doubled down on Mediterranean olive oil as edible proof of tradition. When the Peace of Augsburg finally allowed rulers to choose their realm's religion in 1555, many subjects discovered their allegiance through their stomachs, swearing loyalty to whoever let them keep their sausage festivals or fish feasts. In the end, the Reformation proved that faith could be as much about feasting as fasting, and that no theological debate was too lofty to be settled with a well-timed platter of roast goose. The image of a medieval king tearing into a haunch of meat with grease dripping down his chin is one of history's most enduring myths, but the truth was far more calculated. Behind closed doors, rulers like Charlemagne preferred meals so simple they'd disappoint a modern diner: boiled vegetables, coarse bread, and the occasional freshwater fish. His biographer Lionheart noted the emperor's private suppers resembled a monk's refectory more than a royal table. This duality wasn't about moderation, it was about preserving the theater of excess for public consumption. A king who feasted modestly in his chambers could stage banquets of legendary proportions when ambassadors visited, making the spectacle all the more shocking by contrast. The king's two stomachs doctrine became a convenient fiction to explain this paradox. Clergy and scholars claimed monarchs possessed a divine digestive system, able to metabolize rich foods that would kill a common man. When gout-ridden kings like Henry VIII still devoured roasted swan, court physicians pointed to this sacred metabolism as proof of God's favor. The reality was more pragmatic. Rulers endured weeks of painful purges and herbal regimens between feasts, their suffering hidden behind tapestry doors while the myth of their bottomless appetites grew. What made this performance so effective was its deliberate inconsistency. A French chronicle from 1323 describes how Philip V would publicly demand second helpings of spiced peacock, only to have his chamberlain discreetly dispose of the plate untouched. The act of appearing to eat became more important than actual consumption, a lesson modern politicians still emulate when photographed pretending to enjoy local delicacies during state visits. Even the infamous Henry VIII, poster child for royal gluttony, played this game strategically. While his public banquets featured dozens of dishes, private kitchen accounts reveal his daily meals often consisted of plain pottage and small beer. The legend of his waistline ballooning to 54 inches served a purpose. It made him a larger-than-life figure, quite literally, in an era when corpulence signaled prosperity. When foreign envoys wrote home about the mountain of food he consumed, they weren't documenting gluttony, they were bearing witness to England's engineered reputation for inexhaustible wealth. The true masterstroke was how rulers weaponized their supposed excesses. After surviving a poisoning attempt, the Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand I deliberately exaggerated his appetite at state banquets, chewing ostentatiously while staring down suspected conspirators. Every bite became a dare. See how your toxins fail against my divine constitution. Meanwhile, the Spanish king Philip II cultivated rumors he could eat an entire suckling pig in one sitting, a useful deterrent to rebels who might question his vigor. This theatrical appetite reached its peak with Louis XIV's Versailles, where the Sun King turned dining into a public sacrament. Nobles fought for the honor of watching him eat, interpreting which dishes he touched as signs of favor. The untouched plates carried equal weight. When Louis pointedly ignored the German ambassador's favorite dessert, it triggered a diplomatic crisis. In the end, these rulers understood that controlling the narrative around their diets was as crucial as controlling taxes or troops. A well-staged feast could fill treasuries, a strategic fast could humble enemies, and the myth of a king's insatiable hunger could keep subjects convinced of his supernatural right to rule. Even the most carefully orchestrated feasts could unravel spectacularly, proving that not all culinary power plays ended in triumph. Take the infamous Frozen Feast of 1403, where Duke Leopold of Austria's winter banquet became a masterclass in humiliation. Determined to showcase his wealth, he ordered tables set in an unheated courtyard, believing the icy setting would amplify his guests' awe. Instead, wine froze in goblets, roasted peacocks hardened into frost-covered statues, and noblemen's breath hung invisible, shivering clouds. Far from impressed, ambassadors wrote home mocking the chattering teeth symphony and the Duke's misguided attempt to turn discomfort into grandeur. The lesson was clear: nature cared little for human pageantry. Then there was the disastrous ambassador's indigestion of 1491, when King James IV of Scotland attempted to outdo his English rivals with a pie concealing live birds. As the crust cracked open, the intended gasp of wonder turned to horror. Startled thrushes, instead of elegantly fluttering, defecated midair onto the laps of a visiting Spanish delegation. The resulting chaos, retching courtiers, wine-soaked silks, and a fleeing monarch became diplomatic legend. James's bid for awe had backfired so thoroughly that Spain delayed their trade negotiations for 2 years, fearing such barbaric hospitality hinted at deeper instability. Some failures were subtler but no less damning. In 1476, the Duke of Milan's attempt to humiliate a rival by serving him spoiled meat during Lent boomeranged when the guest loudly praised the miraculous putrid flavors as proof of divine favor. The Duke's own court, trapped by decorum, had to choke down the rancid dish while their target dined smugly on bread. Others miscalculated their guests' endurance, like the 1528 endless banquet in Prague, where Emperor Ferdinand's 7-hour feast left ambassadors groaning on benches, their political resolve weakened not by persuasion but by indigestion. The common thread in these disasters, underestimating the audience. A Bavarian count's floating banquet on a lake, meant to dazzle with reflected torchlight, ended with half the nobility seasick and the other half knee-deep in water after a makeshift dock collapsed. His carefully planned symbolism of ruling even the waves dissolved into sodden farce. Likewise, the French king who served 100 identical sugar swans forgot one unbreakable rule of power dining: spectacle without substance is just empty calories. When guests realized no real food accompanied the sugary army, they deserted the hall in search of actual sustenance, their loyalty evaporating faster than spun sugar. Perhaps the most poetic failure belonged to the Banquet of Ashes in Rome, 1408. A pope seeking to humble cardinals by serving dishes resembling rotting fish and burnt bread didn't account for their creativity. The princes of the church simply declared the meal an allegory for Christ's suffering, turning the intended humiliation into a celebrated act of piety. The kitchen spite became the guest's sanctity, proving that even failed feasts could be spun provided one had the wit to play the game to the end. The echoes of medieval banquet halls resonate in the hushed power lunches of Wall Street and the meticulously choreographed state dinners of modern capitals. While the tapestries have been replaced by minimalist decor and the silver trenchers by fine china, the underlying calculus remains unchanged: who sits where, who eats what, and who toasts first still dictates the invisible hierarchies of influence. Consider the G7 summit's infamous family photo. where world leaders jockey for center position with the same intensity as nobles angling for a seat near the king's right hand. The dais may now be a neutral backdrop, but the message is identical. Proximity equals power, and every millimeter of placement is a geopolitical statement. Corporate mergers, too, have their roots in the betrothal feasts of old. When tech CEOs clink champagne flutes to seal a billion-dollar deal, they're replaying the Burgundian tradition of toasting dynastic unions, only now the dowry is stock options instead of duchies. The modern due diligence process mirrors medieval envoys inspecting a bride's castle ladders. Today's analysts scrutinize balance sheets with the same fervor as 15th century ambassadors counting smoked hams. Even the ritual survives, just as a medieval contract might stipulate the number of peacocks served at a wedding feast. Contemporary merger agreements often include clauses about executive dining privileges, turning corner office lunchrooms into the new high tables. Menu diplomacy has evolved with surgical precision. When a U.S. president serves Maine lobster to a visiting French leader, it's not just regional pride, it's a quiet nod to transatlantic trade. The absence of pork at a White House dinner for Middle Eastern delegates carries the same coded weight as a medieval host avoiding beef during Lent to flatter clerical guests. Modern leaders have even weaponized dietary restrictions, like the German chancellor who once honored a vegan climate activist by serving an entirely plant-based state meal, a culinary mic drop that aligned her government with environmental reform without uttering a single policy speech. The true heirs to medieval spymasters, today's event planners, the staff coordinating a Davos dinner or a Silicon Valley gala, wield influence that would make a Byzantine silent server blush. Their seating charts are psychological masterpieces. Placing a rising startup founder next to a venture capitalist is the 21st century equivalent of a king seating a rebellious vassal beside a wealthy bishop. And just as medieval minstrels slipped propaganda into ballads, modern influencers hired for corporate retreats weave brand messaging into their casual performances. Even the fail-safe strategies endure. The Medici trick of disguising debt as dominion finds its parallel in tech moguls hosting lavish parties during funding crunches, projecting unshakable stability. The Black Death era, feast through famine mentality lives on in recession era galas where hedge fund managers order $1,000 wines while headlines scream about economic collapse. The tools have changed: Instagram posts instead of sugar sculptures, press leaks instead of poisoned chalices, but the goal remains identical. Control the narrative and you control the game. Perhaps the most telling evolution is in the tableware. Medieval nobles used personalized knives to assert status. Today's elites commission monogrammed cutlery or designer chopsticks for their penthouse dinners. The Venetian spying pie has been reborn as the discreet smartphone folder left face up beside dessert plates, capturing off-the-record remarks. And just as a medieval host might gift a jeweled dagger to secure loyalty, modern executives present limited edition whiskey or signed cookbooks, tangible symbols of connection that bind recipients as surely as any feudal oath. The banquet hall's greatest legacy isn't in the food or the finery, but in the unspoken truth it revealed. Power isn't just taken, it's performed. Whether the stage is a candlelit castle or a glass-walled conference room, the script remains the same. Break bread together but watch your back. Raise your glass but count your allies. And never forget, the most important deals aren't signed in boardrooms, but over plates that have been carefully arranged to tell a story far richer than whatever's actually on the menu. As we lower our goblets on this journey through medieval banquets, remember, every bite you take at a dinner party today is a whisper of this ancient political theater. The next time you argue over a seating chart or fret about a menu, know you're walking in the footsteps of kings who understood that food is never just food, it's the oldest language of power. Consider how a modern CEO strategically seats rivals beside investors at a charity gala, or how a wedding planner's seating arrangement can reignite decades-old family feuds. The tools have changed. No one's serving gilded swans or poisoned wine these days, we hope, but the game remains the same. Think about the last time you scrolled through Instagram, marveling at a friend's meticulously plated dinner. That's not just hunger talking, it's the same impulse that made medieval nobles commission sugar sculptures of their castles. Today's influencers staging lavish brunches are the spiritual heirs of Burgundian dukes, trading tapestries for TikTok views. And when politicians pose at diners with greasy burgers, they're playing the same card as Henry VIII, using food to craft an image, whether it's approachability or unchecked indulgence. The real magic lies in how these traditions hide in plain sight. That coworker who always brings homemade cookies to meetings, they've mastered the art of edible diplomacy, disarming critics with chocolate chips instead of honeyed words. The holiday host who insists everyone try their great-grandmother's recipe isn't just sharing food, they're enforcing cultural legacy, much like medieval queens who used feasts to solidify dynastic ties. Even your reluctance to take the last slice echoes ancient fears of overstepping invisible hierarchies. So the next time you find yourself decoding a dinner invitation's dress code or agonizing over wine pairings, smile. You're not being petty, you're participating in a 1,000-year-old performance where every detail carries weight. The banquet hall may have traded torchlight for track lighting, but the stakes endure: who gets included, who gets praised, and who leaves hungry for more. If you've ever sensed hidden currents swirling beneath a seemingly simple meal, you're right. You've tasted history's secret sauce. Share your own stories of edible intrigue below, and let's keep unraveling the delicious, devious ways food shapes our world. Don't forget to subscribe, because the best stories aren't just in history books, they're on the table in front of us, waiting to be savored.